Ben Aaronovitch wrote the target novelisation of his first TV story, Remembrance of the Daleks, he pretty much created the language and setting that the Doctor Who Virgin New Adventures would take. His next work for Doctor Who would be to write the 10th New Adventure. Having such a pedigree already, hopes would have been high. So was anyone expecting it to turn out to be one of the most controversial books in the entire range? Welcome back to the Library of St John the Beheaded, a history of Doctor Who in prose, and this time we'll be investigating Transit by Ben Aaronovitch. Ben Aaronovitch was the third New Adventures writer to have also penned a story for the TV series, keeping things a fairly even split between that group, those who'd been involved in Who in other ways, and complete newcomers, which feels like a pretty sensible ratio to me. Aaronovitch was one of the writers who'd been heavily involved in the creation of the Cartmel master plan for the show's final 3 seasons, and the Remembrance of the Daleks novelisation clearly put him on the rad side of the rad-trad split. Even the less well-revered and more traditional Battlefield, his second and final TV story, has a lot of unusual lore scattered around its edges, so he was clearly the perfect kind of writer to bring on board for this brave, challenging new line of Doctor Who stories. Of course, that was before the deadline started approaching, with no sign of a finished book. The author describes a period of massive procrastination, or research, followed by a period of sustained panic, writing after the deadline had gone, something that rings very true having read about his later novels as well, and might well explain why his original idea of wanting to write another story set in the American Civil War was something he simply never got around to. This led to the book being delivered incredibly late, well past the given deadline, and resulting in the first draft being one that got published, which does explain quite a lot. Because yes, Transit is one of the most controversial Doctor Who novels. Aaronovitch admits that the first thing that would have gone, had he given himself time for a second draft, would be the excessive swearing. It's a very adult book, almost trying hard to prove something, and that's one of the most common criticisms aimed at the V&As. It's not often true, and even in the case of Transit, it doesn't feel too excessive, but a second draft with a slightly more measured tone would have done the book wonders. The book's working title was Stunnel, and it was very loosely based on an idea the author had for a TV story, and it's one that can be quite hard to imagine given some of the content of the book. At Virgin, editor Peter Darvill-Evans' assistant Riona McNamara left in 1992 and was replaced by a new editorial assistant, Rebecca Levine, someone who would go on to play an enormous part of the range further down the line. Her first job was proofreading Transit. The book received a lot of complaints, largely for its sex and swearing. It's difficult to know where to sit with this particular issue. Aaronovitch's assertion that people just do have sex is a particularly fair one, as is his explanation of the book's most controversial line about the taste of semen. The reasoning behind the notorious taste of semen scene is that I had 2 characters who were prostitutes, and I didn't want to glamorise that. That one line lets you know she's doing a horrible job. Of course, context is everything, and while I don't think any of the content is inherently bad, I can understand people who find it out of place and maybe a bit tasteless in a Doctor Who setting. We have, let's remember, only just seen the departure of a character whose harshest insult was toe rag. Not everybody hated it. Future Who authors Kate Orman and Lawrence Miles are big fans, with Miles once claiming it to be his favourite book of all time, not just Doctor Who, and claiming that nobody else in the early 90s ever wrote anything so inventive or so humanistic. On the other hand, future Big Finish founder and Doctor Who TV script editor Gary Russell absolutely hated it. The BBC, meanwhile, didn't care at all. Doctor Who was not seriously on their radar by the end of 1992. Although Aaronovitch didn't really know about it himself, Darvill-Evans was still seeking a new companion, and whilst Benny was always a firm favourite, Transit's character, Cadiatu Lethbridge Stewart, was acknowledged by the editor as a potential replacement for Ace. It wasn't to be, of course. And yes, Cadiato Lethbridge Stewart is the name of the Brigadier's granddaughter via an affair he had while serving in Africa. That bit of lore is also Aaronovitch's, coming from the Remembrance of the Daleks book. Is this fanwank? Absolutely. People turning out to be related to the Brig is always pushing it. Yes, this is my way of saying I really dislike this happening in Twice Upon a Time. At least this Cadiato is adopted, so there's a little more separation. She grew up with stories of her great-great-great-great-great-grandfather and his adventures with the Doctor, so of course she's about to meet him. Near the end of the book we get a much lengthier telling of the story of the Brig and his brief affair with Cadiato Sr. Her dreams about the Pythia caused the Doctor to explain about the curse that caused Gallifrey to become sterile, suggesting a link between her and the Time Lords. Has been hinted that maybe her existence is Earth's response to the existence of the Doctor. It seems a bit daft to me. Cadiato is at least a very interesting and unique character in her own right. It's mostly good, very cyberpunky stuff. She's basically a prototype super soldier created for the 1,000 Days War between Earth and Mars, something that gets its first mention here, initially mistakenly as the 100 Days War, but then corrected midway through. Peter Darvill-Evans not showing off as an editor again there. Although now living independently, she still has killer instincts and immense strength. The Doctor discovers that she's also researching time travel, very successfully too. She's pretty much the Doctor's companion for transit, with Benny... well, Aaronovitch has said he wishes he'd written Benny into the book more, and certainly would have done so now. While Paul Cornell had given her as good a start as one might hope for a new companion, with the brilliantly rounded depiction in Love and War, which had been given to Ben, so he could include her here, it must still have been difficult to simply write in someone else's character without really knowing them. He would massively make up for this many years later with the superb Benny novel Genius Loci, which fully gets to grips with who she is and why. It's weird though, had this story come much later, the decision to basically have Benny possessed by the enemy for the bulk of the story, that would have been fine, but to have it happen to a character we barely know, in her first proper novel as companion, it just feels jarring. We get no chance to feel anxious for her, while her murderous rampage, unexplained until halfway through the book, just seems to make little sense. Is this really the same character we met in the previous book? Just ends up being pretty hard going. You know what? Hard going is a good description of the book in general. Honestly, I don't mind all the adult stuff. In the setting, it feels appropriate. But take a listen to this. After a metaphorical prologue of the Doctor watching human evolution play out, we get the first proper page of the story, and it reads like this. Olympus Mons West. Credit Card took the call from Central, but he had to shout to make himself heard. Dogface was arguing over a game of damage with old Sam. Only Dogface was crazy enough to pick a fight with an old veteran like Sam, but Dogface always said that even old Sam got bored with pushing people about. It was good therapy, he said, to stand up to him from time to time. At the time the call came in, both were in full flight, old Sam on his feet with his two-tone dreadlocks flailing around his head, Blondie edging towards the door, while Lambarda surreptitiously cleared away any breakables from the table. Dogface was leaning comfortably back in his chair, arms across his chest, a big Eastwood clamped in his mouth. Old Sam had cranked up to full volume, swearing in something that had been an Indo-European language about 200 years ago. Credit Card figured that the military must have augmented his lungs along with the rest of his body. Credit Card sighed, stuck his right index finger in the slot and jacked into the system direct. What the hell's going on down there? Credit Card winced. Talking to Ming the Merciless was a pain face to face. Going direct was like rubbing his brain on a cheese grater. Keep it down, he said. I'm plugging in. Ming the Merciless had a problem, mainly a brownout on the central line which was knocking 15 seconds off transit time station to station. Ming was very democratic. If she had a problem, she liked to spread it around. We're on a break. Ming didn't care. She wanted the problem sorted out now. Now, that isn't the first page of a book that welcomes you into its world with open arms. That's a first page whose only goal in life is to be as oblique and irritating as possible. To baffle and confound the reader and leave them feeling alienated. The names, the cultural references, the suggestion that we're meant to have the faintest idea what's going on here, it's just all too much. Of course, if you find yourself too confused by what's being said, one can always check out the glossary at the back of the book. That's right, this futuristic Martian culture has so much of its own slang that Ben Aaronovitch thought you'd need a translator to be able to read the book. Basically, it's a typical first-time author issue. He had too many ideas and wanted to include them all in case he didn't get another opportunity. And so it's just completely overwhelming. The whole book is written like this. There's a plot amidst all this. Transit is named for the setting, the public transport service that runs via subspace throughout the solar system. It's a lot like your usual subway, like the London Tube, all different lines in different colours on the map, only it covers everything orbiting the sun, and using subspace, every stop is equidistant, making travel simple and quick. Sounds great, but for two things. One, this is a bleak dystopian cyberpunk, or post-cyberpunk according to Lawrence Miles, period in the solar system, and two, there's something big and nasty infiltrating the new stellar tunnel, the Stunnel, which is about to open, allowing travel to other star systems. The Stunnel sounds absurd, even worse than the Chunnel. The nickname the Channel Tunnel would have been going under at this point, i.e. before it opened and people quickly stopped using that ridiculous word. Real-life shootings are shown as entertainment. People are mugged for body parts. Slum areas have more than 80% unemployment. A recession is ongoing. PR firms rent entire crowds to make their clients look good. Security and policing are provided by the KGB. This is the solar system as an expansion of the world seen in Andrew Cartmel's Warhead. Anyway, yes, the story. We follow the group of ludicrously named characters who work on the transport system that we were introduced to on the first page. They know the system inside out, and we learn much about it. The static of a train arriving tastes like cinnamon. Freight trains going into these slums never come out with anything, even empty crates. A Series 2 Class B train weighs 14,000 kilograms in standard gravity. These are people you can trust to spot when something is wrong. It starts with power being stolen from the tunnels, but becomes a lot worse with time. When the inaugural journey to the Arcturus system goes wrong, our team of ridiculous named engineers go to investigate. And nobody's in the terminus, just mysterious organic blue splatters radiating away from the gateway. The remains of everyone who was there, including the president. Meanwhile, the Doctor and Benny have arrived. The Doctor immediately saves Kediatu from whatever it is that's coming through the stellar tunnel. I'm not calling it a tunnel, I'm sorry. And they go off together to get pissed. Other than the third Doctor enjoying your glass of wine, this is the first real sign of the Doctor drinking alcohol. This was one of the book's many controversial points. On their fourth bottle of ouzo, the Doctor casually mentions that it's the universe's 13,500,020,012th birthday. As you do. Kediatu, like the reader, assumes he's pretending to be drunk, until he passes out. It's all very odd. The thing from the tunnel, meanwhile, glances off Benny, leaving her dazed and in pain, seeking salvation from two prostitutes, including Zemina and the infamous Seaman line. The villain of the piece is completely abstract and undescribed, and apparently from another dimension, broken through to by accident by the tunnel designers, which effectively means it's a non-corporeal entity that travels through the energy network of the train system, inhabiting the bodies of people it kills, and also inhabiting Benny, but keeping her alive. For all its variety, its imagination, and its potential to be just about anything, Doctor Who has a lot of non-corporeal entities that travel through energy and possess bodies. So what makes this different? Well, it seems to enjoy turning its victims into grotesque, cartoonish freaks, transmogrifying human bodies to have no mouths, enormously knobbly noses with fingers coming off them, lamps jammed into eye sockets, spines and spikes protruding from various body parts. One guy has a proboscis in place of a tongue. It's all very era-specific body horror, Cronenberg's Naked Lunch mixed with Hellraiser mixed with Altered States, although whether it's entirely necessary is another matter. At one point, one of them attacks the group of tunnel engineers, his mouth replaced by a series of concentric circles with rotating teeth and bone, an organic food dispenser designed to obliterate flesh. Aaronovitch seems to revel in creating more and more grotesque monsters. There had been a number of teething troubles in the first batch. One of the new artificers had managed to turn herself inside out and had to be scraped off the walls. One of the conversion jobs had gone wrong and left Mariko with a Razvedka with a 4-foot mouth. Every time his teeth started spinning, he'd fall over. 3 crew had him lying on his back in a side tunnel and were using him for waste disposal. Amidst all this, and there's a lot of the book set aside to all the characters going through these motions in detail, a computer hacker called Francine with a barely comprehensible backstory starts investigating a company called Imogen. After some lengthy action, this turns out to be Kadiatu's backstory, Francine's friend, Brigadier Yembe Lethbridge Stewart, that is, helps her break into Imogen's HQ to find super soldiers being grown. One awakes, calls him Dada, and he decides to take her as a daughter. It's timed pretty well, appearing just before Kadiatu punches one of the malformed possessed creatures that are terrorising the train network, breaking its skull and pushing its forehead back into its brain. Lovely. She finishes off another with her foot. This is where we learn that she has super strength. There's then a lot of fairly long-winded travel sections. The Doctor and Kadiatu end up all over the solar system, and a number of creature attacks at stations, which is how I sum up a chunk of about 200 pages. There's a nice moment where the Doctor is very kind to an AI and gently suggests it stop taking human bullshit and become independent. It seems very grateful. After what feels like several expansive novels worth of text, we finally reach the climax of the story where all our characters come together for an explosive battle, and then finally a reveal of what's going on. Unfortunately, it's at this point that the book dives into an abstract world of imagination. The Doctor dives into the theoretical hyperspace link between Earth and Arcturus and starts creating imaginary spaces around him. Searching for Benny using elements of his imagination, his first choice is the Cheetah People, which is suitable given future Benny voice actor Lisa Bowerman played one in Survival. Oh god, why do they do this? It's not the first example in the New Adventures. Paul Cornell's novels so far have both featured imaginary planes of existence, and both have been reasonably well constructed, and it won't be the last. But very few of them work. Maybe it's just the fact that there's no real frame of reference, or maybe the lack of obvious rules, but these things just feel so wishy-washy and frankly lazy. Can't think of a way to creatively defeat your super strong enemy? Just head into an imaginary space and use some kind of made-up energy source on it. Kadiatu goes hunting with a cat, a silver one from the Cat's Cradle trilogy it seems. The Doctor is attacked by who knows what in the form of a monstrous creature. Nodes are travelled to and from. It's all very tedious. Every now and then a wonderfully poetic phrase comes through. A great roaring wall of nothing like a silent tsunami really stood out to me. But on the whole it's just self-indulgent nonsense. It gets to the point where the Doctor, the Ministry of Primary Colours, and the King are having an in-depth chat about primary subsets and utilities that's so obtuse that I begin to think Aaronovitch is trolling the reader when finally the villain of the piece, named Fred by the Doctor, arrives and we get the showdown. The Doctor is once again on the back foot, and for this scheming, manipulative incarnation it's remarkable how often that's the case, with Fred having set up the entire scenario to lure the Doctor into this imaginary world, having immediately pinpointed him as the most interesting thing in the solar system upon arrival. If you ask me on pain of death to describe what happened to make the Doctor defeat the tunnel invader, I'd ask if I could choose the weapon. He stretches his arm out, a hologram of an Earth celebrity steps out of Benny's body, and all is well. I checked the TARDIS wiki for a more accurate interpretation, and it tells me the sentience inhabiting Benny to this point was simply an agent of the main threat, which seems to have come through at the end of the book. Wait, no, wasn't that Fred? Apparently one is okay without conquest, while the other is killed by Kadiatu. I reread that section of the book again and I'm still none the wiser. And this is why I hate abstract imagination land nonsense. Just make it clear what has actually happened. Either way, it's underwhelming. It's an abstract solution to an abstract threat, which has a symmetry, I suppose, but not one which makes for satisfying storytelling. In the end, I'm not entirely sure what the threat was, what its plans were, or why, or exactly how it was beaten. Anyway, it's a happy ending for everyone, including the AI the Doctor was kind to, being protected by civil rights laws and giving itself a name, Florence, which is lovely. Florence will return in 38 books' time, at which point I imagine everyone will have forgotten anyway. I certainly had on first read. Given just how unlike the TV show the book feels, once you strip away the layers of dystopian grime, it's not actually that hard to see how it might have worked on screen. For a start, the usual classic Who filler is there. A lengthy chase across the surface, the tunnel engineers getting up to not much. But there's also probably only enough actual plot to fill a McCoy-style three-parter. Beneath all the descriptions or the world building, not all that much really happens. We even get a classic cliffhanger with Kadiatu killing Benny. It turns out not to be her, of course. Still, I can fairly accurately describe the plot while missing out the majority of the second half of the book, which does feel like a slight waste of pages. The Doctor is once again not entirely himself, acting maybe less predictably than ever. The fact that he heads off drinking with Kadiatu, minus Benny, after the initial attack by the creature, is an odd way to start. We actually get a little insight into his mind, or at least his dreams. He dreams of recently departed Ace on the planet Heaven. He imagines her as a wolf, proud and headstrong, tireless and loyal. At one point he finds himself watching what appears to be an opera based on events of Aaronovitch's TV story Battlefield. It's part of a computer program tracking the Doctor's history, and feels a little like the author being clever for the sake of it. Kadiatu points out that bad news and trouble follows him wherever he goes, something of a new series staple. This is, to the best of my knowledge, the earliest reference to that kind of thing. The Doctor's Kent house on Allen Road is still standing largely unchanged. First introduced a few books ago in Warhead, its appearance here is the first time it's clear the property will be a regular fixture in the new adventures. For all his surprisingly carefree attitude towards the fact that his new companion has been possessed and is now rampaging about the travel network on a killing spree, he's otherwise at his most relaxed and normal here, lacking much of his recent darkness. He has some unusual skills, removing the lids of tins of tomatoes by tapping their sides, and some strange quirks, pocketing the lids. But we get to see a little of his thought processes as he wanders round his house, happy to have somewhere solid and permanent, enjoying the sounds of Kadiatu and Blondie chasing and flirting, cooking pasta and pondering the invasive alien in the tunnels. He builds a transmitter out of household junk and ancient technology and gets in touch with the entity, which immediately responds with a line from the Outer Limits. Later, during a jet crash, we're afforded an amusing peek at his internal dialogue as he calculates the amount of damaged equipment he's responsible so far on this adventure. Even with companions only scoring half, he awards himself an impressive 36 points as the craft smashes into the surface of Mars. As a piece of world-building, Transit is not only the finest in the Virgin New Adventures so far, but it's arguably second only to Aaronovitch's second novel, The Also People, to come much later. Frankly, the reason I struggle to talk about the plot is because most of the text is description. The whole thing is dripping with detail and texture, paragraph after paragraph of history and culture and law and science and slang and food and commerce and politics and everything else that makes up a society, dished out in wonderful, if dense, blocks of text. It's more than easy to imagine oneself in the transit network on Mars while reading the book. Not necessarily the nicest experience, but a remarkably impressive one. Occasionally, Aaronovitch falls back on cliches. We get a butterfly flapping its wings, causing storms once more. But generally the text is full of odd little moments that are all original, if sometimes a bit strange or inexplicable. A Victorian 3p coin, hierarchical polyamory being the relationship norm in this era, salsa thrash being a popular style of music, an Ice Warrior word called xis, which must be him taking the piss. A top with the slogan "Eat fish and die" written on it. There's some really bizarre world building, such as this baffling sentence. Even in this century, computers were linked to other computers, and use of them was unsafe and therefore forbidden. Maybe that made sense in 1992? Remarkably, for all the detail in text, there's very little in the way of back-referencing. Indeed, elements of earlier books appear far more often than elements of the TV series, the most obvious being Kadiatu's origins in the Rememberers novelisation, but also a sneaky reference to the muscular heroic figures of ancient Gallifrey as seen in Time's Crucible. There's a mention of Gilgamesh, Kadiatu dreams about the Pythia, Benny has read a paper about the Butler Institute's role in Earth's ecological collapse. If it weren't for the operatic potted history of the Doctor as collated by Kadiatu, this could have been the first new adventure not to reference a TV story. Okay, the Doctor also mentions visiting all three Atlantises, but that feels like an Easter egg. He also points out that Earth must be a major time-space nexus, given all the things that happen there. The book owes a lot to Andrew Cartmell's Warhead, a large cast of characters, frequently ones who don't even meet each other, the exceptionally bleak dystopia, the enormous geographical scale of the story, this time covering the entire solar system rather than just various places on Earth, the Doctor having a mysterious aloofness, turning up in places without explanation. The differences are in the writing. Transit is uglier, both in its focus but also in heavier, sludgier prose, and the purpose. Where Warhead is angry and makes its targets clear, Transit's far more nihilistic, with a barely knowable villain and a broad shrug of everything's fucked to its worldview. With all the niche, weird detail and the locale-specific descriptions, we don't get all that much continuity in terms of the future history cycle of books, but Transit seeds the history of Mars. The 100 Days War here is later retconned to the 1000 Days War and is seen as a momentous occasion in the planet's history. Although it's not somewhere we really visit on the TV show, only really Pyramids, Waters and Empress of Mars, two of those both long after this, we do at least know that the native Martians are ice warriors. As a species, the ice warriors get a lot of expansion in the expanded universe, helped by Benny being an expert in Martian history, and this is where it begins. The swearometer registers 9 fucks, the only 9 fucks in Doctor Who novels, some bastards, a piss and a bollocks. As well as the semen, there's also a reference to a sexual climax. There's also the phrase suspicious-looking lingerie, which I find utterly hilarious for some reason. Kadiatu's friend Max wants to be in her body. That's not a euphemism, he literally wants to borrow her body to walk around in. It's something he's quite desperate to do, but not in a kinky way. Is he trans? Is this the kind of thing people do to explore gender in the future? They're all very transhumanist cyberpunk, and just another of those details that could probably be the basis of an entire story, but here is little more than a fairly throwaway page of text. As with the previous book, there are a lot of dreadlocks here. The point where ravers began to become hippies in the early 90s saw a huge rise in the number of white people with dreads. It was a sign of the times. Structurally, the book split into 2 parts. The only major cliffhanger comes at the end of part 1, the revelation that something else is on its way down the tunnel from Arcturus and will be arriving in 48 hours. Chapters are split into sub-chapters based on location, and these come at frequently quite a rapid rate, only adding to the dense, confusing prose. Once again, we get the chance to dive into a sea of amusingly dated images of future computing, a place where using the internet, or whatever network around, is explored more like a virtual reality than conventional computing. Software wanders the computer network, its visual representation something metaphorical. Hackers feel physical sensations in response to what's going on in the computer. A mixture of the lawnmower man and hackers. Who knows, maybe in 100 years' time this will be how we explore computer networks, if we're still even around. But at the moment it feels like one of those charmingly naive views of the future that were everywhere in the 90s. More seriously, the Doctor and Kadiatu put on pressure suits made in Israel/Palestine, which feels about as unlikely as any of the far-out sci-fi stuff these days. And faxes are still a thing. Maybe my biggest issue with the book, outside its occasional borderline unreadableness, is that it commits the same sin as Love and War, with the level of threat seeming slightly unearned. Not that I think sticking to a strict formula is a healthy thing, but your classic Who story, and I mean that word in the broadest sense, both the original and revival series, has the events ramp up gradually, either via red shirt deaths or the Doctor investigating. Here, as in the previous book, there's a kind of blanket acceptance that there's something big and terrible happening, without it feeling earned. The Doctor is investigating before he's even seen anything really happen. The enormous chaos caused by the President being killed and the whole transit network being invaded by malformed murderous monstrosities is barely seen, other than a handful of isolated attacks and the news that there are more complaints about delayed trains than ever before. With neither the terrible claustrophobia of a base under siege, nor the catastrophic chaos of an apocalyptic epic, it feels like we're just expected to acknowledge that bad stuff is going on without most of the tension that should come with it. The fact that the Doctor has time to get drunk after being hit by the arrival of the creature and the loss of his companion is a perfect example. The pace is just saggy. It'd be like a Dalek threat appearing at the start of Bad Wolf and then still being asked to care about the game show plot. It just doesn't work structurally. I admire Transit as a striking and original novel, one that makes no concessions to convention and treats its readers like intelligent people. I even kind of admire that it throws in early New Adventures edginess with an actual purpose rather than acting like a kid who's just turned 18 and drunk their body weight in cider, as most treated the opportunity to add adult themes into Doctor Who. But none of this makes an especially readable novel, and that's where it majorly falls down. Overall, it's less than the sum of its parts. By filling the text with slang and names that mean nothing to the reader, fracturing the story into dozens of page-long sub-chapters, and making our lead characters simply two of an enormous ensemble cast, Ben Aaronovitch creates a difficult, alienating book that's easier to put down than turn the page of. The utterly baffling and completely vague climax does it no favours either. If it were leading somewhere especially great, the rather poor build-up might at least feel worth the effort. Coupled with the relentlessly bleak view of the future and extreme body horror, and despite tons of memorable images and some incredible writing, the result is ultimately a book I have no desire to read ever again. Some favourite quotes then. The train's field regulator charged up, and the gateway field flickered and strobed as air molecules were sucked into the tunnel. Then, with ponderous grace, 14 tons of metal, ceramic, copper and human flesh surged forward to start its journey through subspace. She remembered a series of boxes within boxes, infinity nesting within the finite, a control room that seemed almost a parody of technology, a figure standing at a console. It too was transdimensional, something monstrous crammed down into a parody of human flesh. That's a great description of the Doctor and TARDIS. The dead were waiting for them at the station. They lined the platform in 4 neat rows, tricked out in their best black body bags for the special occasion. Pinned to the foot end of each bag was a white smart card, little robotic forget-me-nots to carry the dead into the inactive files of the system database. Some of the bags were far too short to contain adults. In my vague arranging of the Virgin New Adventures in 2 seasons, Transit opens Season 3, or 29 if counted as a continuation of the TV series. Season 3 contains 4 stories, and I don't massively like any of them. Indeed, I'd go so far as to say it's down there with my least favourite runs of Doctor Who ever. Depressingly, Transit is my second favourite of the 4, and my favourite has major issues in itself. In our next visit to the Library of St John the Beheaded, we'll be taking a look at a couple of them: The Highest Science by Gareth Roberts and The Pit by Neil Penswick. Before then, do leave me a comment or a like below, and I hope you'll join me for that video. We have, let's remember... Indeed, elements of earlier books appear far more often than elements